Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Granite Family History Center class for a Tuesday evening. We're delighted to have with us this evening Chris Cummings, and his topic is Census Tips and Tricks for finding your ancestors in the U.S. Census. And Chris has a rich background. He's worked in genealogical pursuits for quite a while now, and he was a consultant with the Granite Family History Center for quite some time. And then he and his wife served a mission. And before that, weren't you with Family Search, Chris?
Yeah, for 38 years. I was with the
just
Family Search and the Family History Department.
Yeah, just a few years there and whatnot. But we're delighted to have Chris with us tonight. A couple of housekeeping things. Watch the chat. If you have questions, you can put them on the chat, or we will have time for a Q&A when Chris has concluded his presentation. And any other questions, like I said, you can put them on chat, and we will try to get those questions answered. This presentation is being recorded, and it will be up on the Granite Family History Center's website in a couple of days. And that website is www.granite, GRANITE, FHC @gmail. Well, that's not right. That's email address. .com, granitefhc.com. And you can just go onto there and find it under the classes section at the top and pull it down and view it along with dozens of other classes we've done over the years. Anytime you'd like to see those. And again, there's no charge for those. So without any further ado, we'll turn the time to Chris.
Thanks, Bob. So hopefully tonight we're going to learn a little bit together about the censuses, primarily in the United States. This is a photo from the Library of Congress that shows an enumerator going door to door conducting an interview. This happened to be for the 1920 census. I wanted to include this because this shows the woman of the household who is being the informant and the enumerator that's asking questions. And notice that she's writing them in a little notebook. She probably didn't want to carry around the large pages that most of the censuses were. So in the process, she's writing down what she hears. They may not have the same native tongue. And then she goes and transcribes it on the official form. So there's lots of opportunities for mistakes to be made. She may not have heard correctly. She may not have written things down correctly. The informant may have chosen for many reasons to not give accurate information. So, but we're grateful that we have the censuses. So what are census records? They're a snapshot of a household in time. So in the United States, there was a federal census taken every decade since 1790. But due to privacy regulations, the most recently available census is 1940. Censuses are not released until for 72 years. So the 1950 census will probably be made available next year sometime. Also, many of the states had their own census between some of the federal censuses. So the censuses were on the decade, and states would sometimes do them on the 5-year mark. While we're going to focus on censuses from the United States, other countries also conducted censuses. So why would you want to use census records? Typically, we walk backwards in time from closest to us working earlier, and we can see how the household changes. We can learn more about our ancestors' lives. They can guide us to additional sources. I've got an example where I'll show how you can clarify that if you've got two people that actually have the same name. Censuses provide a great service because they're mostly a national census, and we can find out where our ancestors lived. And I find it fun just looking at the historic documents. So here's an example of walking backwards in time to see how the family changes. You might, in one decade, the nearest decade, you might find a widow living with her children. Prior to that, it may be a retired couple. The decade prior to that, it might be the last children are getting ready to leave the nest. The whole family could be together in the prior census. A decade earlier might be just the first children or newlyweds. And prior to that, we may find our ancestors living with their own parents. So why were censuses taken? In the United States, census population is used to determine representation in Congress. That's the party line. We really know it was for genealogy. And we can use multiple census decades to pull together a whole family picture. So what kind of information is available in a census record? It varies from decade to decade, and kind of depends on the concerns at the time. There are some censuses that ask about whether the family had a radio or not, as the government was looking at how to reach people with different ways. So from 1790 until 1840, the censuses only recorded the head of the household. They had a count of the number of children, and these were typically broken out by 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on. And then up to 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. Some censuses included whether they were male, female, or whether they were free or slaves. 1850 is a great census. It's the first census that actually lists every person that was enumerated, not just the head of the household. And some very helpful and often overlooked information includes occupation, the value of the dwelling, mother of how many children, and birthplace of parents. Now, not all censuses give this information, but I hope to be able to point out how that information can be helpful to you. So this just walks through the headings that show the columns that were and the information that was captured decade by decade. And one of the main things to see on this, well, first of all, if you're having trouble reading the census and want to know the information in the heading, you can go to Family Search or Ancestry. Most of them have blank forms, and you can readily read the information that was captured in the heading. It's also interesting to note that in 1790, there was relatively sketchy information. The 1800 and 1810 followed the same format, and we're getting more breakdown on age and some additional questions as we move into the 1850s and 1860s. Again, 1850, every person in the household. Again, you can tell that in the more recent censuses, the information just gets richer and richer. The 1900 and the 1910 census asked two important questions. They asked mother of how many children and how many children were living. And that's very useful if you're wanting to see if you know of all the children that the women had. 1930, or excuse me, this is the 1940 census, and again, there's lots of information. The 1940 census did kind of an interesting thing. For two of the individuals on the sheet that was enumerated, they gathered more information. And they also noted where the residence was in 1935. So here's a couple of tricks that we'll talk about. If you're having a challenge finding your ancestor and I mean, maybe they have a common name, like my grandfather's name was James. And there were some problems in finding his record. But he had a brother named Clyde, and Clyde is a much less common name. And so by searching on Clyde and some other key pieces of information, I was able to find the family. You want to look for married daughters that are nearby. And you can kind of identify if it's a married daughter by looking at the age of the children, and also by looking at the birth. If the census has the birthplaces of the parents, and it's an unusual combination, that can give you some pretty good clues. I love when I see the in-laws are identified, as it can give us a clue as to the woman or the maiden name of the mother. I've talked about mother of how many children, and as a way to make sure you have all of them. Another trick is if you're not able to find your family, but you found them in a census a decade later or a decade earlier, you may want to look at their neighbors and see if you can find their neighbors in the census year you're trying to find, because sometimes they were neighbors for a long time. Occupation progression is helpful to kind of confirm that you're dealing with the same family. If the I mean, it's not unusual for someone who was a farmer to get another profession later on, or for some things to change. I watched one of my cousins, as I was doing some descendancy research, go from being a clerk at a hardware store to a manager, clerk to a salesman to a manager. And later in his funeral, it said he became the president of the hardware company. So watching the progression, if it's a radical change, maybe you're dealing with someone that has the same name but isn't really your ancestor. You can also use kind of relative wealth. If your family was very poor and stayed very poor, and you all of a sudden find someone very wealthy with the same name, it may not be them. So as you look at the censuses that have kind of a wealth indication, can guide you a little bit. Also, if you're not finding them in the county that they were in, it may be that the boundaries have changed. Even they may not have moved, but the boundaries have changed, and you need to look to see if they're in an adjacent county, or in some cases, if they're on the border of a state, either they may have moved, or in early times the state boundaries could have shifted. Okay, so let me show you an example of using that trick about Clyde. I was looking for Horace Cummings, and he was born in 1858. And he's actually the top line of this census. How this record was extracted, and you can tell that the extractor did their very best, but with the tabulation marks that are written on top of his given name, it made it hard to read. This record was indexed as blank because Horace was pretty much obliterated, and blank dumbing because that the C is written in an unusual way, and it shows that he was born in, it looks like, 1808. If you look really closely, you can see a faint line at the top of the 0, and it really is a 5. And if you look at his wife, Barbara, it's similar. she's 1859 and she's 40 years old. He was 1858 and he's 41. So you can see that it really does match, it does fit. But the search criteria I used to find this record is I used Clyde. I knew exactly where they were living, so I used an exact place. And then I didn't use any surname at all. And so I was able to find the family. I could also have used, there is a place on Family Search where you can list other names. So I could have also listed some of the other names in the family, which may have brought this record up to the top. Another thing you want to do is you want to look for other relatives that are nearby or possibly within the same household. So this household, at the middle of the page, it's James Moses. You'll notice that, and this is in the 1860 census, and it doesn't really list relationships, but from other sources, I know that Esther is his mother, Giles is his brother, and near the top, there's a Parnell that's his sister, and Adelia is also a sister. So when you find your relative, and I would encourage you to always look for the whole family, and become familiar with other people on the page, because you may find other family names that can help in your research. So I mentioned you could distinguish between two people that have the same name. So here's kind of an extreme case. We've got Josiah T. Cummings, and he was residing in Dunstable, Middlesex, Massachusetts in the 1850 census. And his wife is Rebecca. Right below him, you've got another Josiah Cummings. He doesn't have the initial T, living in Dunstable, Massachusetts, and his wife is Rebecca, spelled a different way. Now you'll notice that their ages are different, and that some of the others that are in the household you can use to distinguish them. But here's an example of where you wouldn't want to merge if you found two Josiah Cummings, but there really were two, because they're both listed in the census and with different ages and different relationships. I don't know if you all know, but you can use wildcards like the question mark and the asterisk to help you find some spelling variations. So the question mark is a wild character, so it will match one character. So here I've typed in Sally R question mark BY, and I found Sarah R Ruby. So the question mark matched the U, but it also matched Roby. So both U and O were matched. You can also use the asterisk, which matches 0 to many characters. And here, and I used them in combination. I've got R question mark B asterisk Y, and that matches ROBEY as well as ROBY. And I found RABY with a question mark. This particular record, I knew it was my family, and so I actually went in and did the edit and to correct it so other people would have an easier time finding the index. But this is Sally Roby, one of my ancestors. If you look through, if you go into a specific piece of information on if you're looking at the person's family page, so this is the family page, or the individual page for Sally Roby, and I'm looking at her name and I'm seeing all of the sources that contributed to her name. And you can see that there are her proper way of spelling it, Roby, but there's the 3 other spelling variations, and those are all represented in different census records. I once heard that someone issued a challenge to find one family where the spellings of both given names and surnames stayed consistent for 4 census decades, because there's just too many opportunities for mistakes. So censuses can tell you where your family lived, and then that can lead you to other sources. So here I went to the Library of Congress, loc.gov, and I found a historic map. This happens to be a land ownership map. And I was looking at, I don't know if you've noticed, but some of the names I was looking at were Moses, there was a Benedict, and Halley. Those are all people that were found in that 1860 census. And this is a land ownership map from probably 1856. Here's a different land ownership map, Dunstable. Dunstable is in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. It's on the border just below Nashua in the state of New Hampshire. I have about 5 generations of Cummingses that came in Dunstable. And so I was interested in doing a little project. Dunstable is a small township. There's only, in the 1850s, there were only about just less than 600 people that lived in the town. And so I wanted to see if I could match up this land ownership map to the 1850 census, and just to kind of see if I could find out where people were. So I went through page by page in the census and looked for the heads of household on the map. And because anyone can link sources to people in the family tree, I wanted to make sure that everybody in this town, because of the time that my family had lived there, I wanted to make sure that everybody in this town was listed in the family tree. And if they were, then I made a link to the 1850 census as a source. In the process of doing so, if I could view my relationship, if I found them in the tree, and if I didn't find them in the tree, then I would add them. But it turns out I'm related to about 90% of the people that lived in this town in the 1850s. This is that same land ownership map, only I have zoomed in, and here is my 3rd cousin 4 times removed. It's kind of in the center.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
In the center of the screen, you see IP Cummins. So I know that sometimes Cummings and Cummins were used interchangeably. And I found him in the census. And I also found I was able to, one of the things I did for family searches, I dealt a lot with localities, and I dealt with maps. And so I took this historic map and I overlaid it on top of Google Maps. So I don't know if you can read the fine print, but those are the actual street names. And so that IP Cummings is on Thorndike Street. Well, recently, as I've been working on several projects with Dunstable, not only the land ownership and the census work I've been doing there, I've been doing some stuff with the cemetery, and I found that there were some headstones that I couldn't find my ancestors in the cemetery, and I was wondering it was because they hadn't filmed the headstones, or if there was more. So about 2 weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, I guess now, my wife and I actually flew into Boston and went to Dunstable, is about 40 miles northwest of Boston. And we drove on Thorndike Street to see if we could kind of find the area where this Isaac P. Cummings home was. And we located it at the cross street of, I think that's Hardy Street. We located the cross street, but couldn't quite tell where. And there was a mature couple out walking their dog in the front of their house. And we stopped and asked them if they knew which home in the neighborhood had been owned by Cummingses. And they were very nice, and they said they'd only owned their home for about a year. But the woman we were talking to, her name was Mary Ann, said, there's a book that's published that has a lot of the historic homes in Dunstable. And she says, I've got a copy, I'm going to go in and get it. So she goes in and gets her copy of the book called Images of America, Dunstable. And she shows it to me, and I thought, well, I wrote it down because I thought I wanted to get a copy. She looks up and finds her house in the book, and it turns out her house was the home of Isaac B. Cummings. So these are the current owners, Jim and Mary Ann. We got to meet them. They were living in the guest house as they were refinishing, redoing the flooring in their home. So, I mean, these stone walls, that house, that foundation. So here's another picture of the house. They're in the process of refinishing the plank flooring in their home. And we got to take a tour inside. We got to go into the basement, see the foundation, the rocks that were used, showed us the beams that were used in the kitchen and in the attic. So that was kind of a, when we say you can learn where your ancestors lived, we got the whole tour. Very, very nice people. All right, I mentioned that county boundaries change. I will give you at the end of my presentation, there's a list of links, but this is from the Newberry Library. They did a very detailed atlas of historic county boundaries. And so here's one county in Illinois and the changes. And they went through the legislation and said, okay, so this county was created from these counties. And then they walk through and talk about how a part of it gets carved off. Most of the time, counties become smaller over time. But this just shows all the changes. And so if you found them in the 1810 census, they may be in a different place in the 1820, 1830, or 1840 census. Here's an example where I found an error in the census itself. So the enumerators weren't perfect, and in copying the information, they could have made a mistake. So this is Parnell Moses Howley, and she's a sister-in-law. So it's written as she's extracted as well, she appears here as a male, but she's actually the sister-in-law, not a son-in-law. So beware, there can be mistakes on the original document. I always encourage, whenever possible, that you go look at the actual image, not just the transcription, and to become familiar with the whole family. And use the number of children to see if you found them all. Those are some things that are helpful. And again, I try to find the family in all of the census decades that are available. Which leads me to this. This is a third party. It's treeseek.com. And they're still around. It's a lot of genealogy. There's a lot of changes. And Some companies are here today and not later on, but this TreeSeek has an option where you can sign in using your Family Search credentials. So your username and password on Family Search, which allows them to go look at your family tree on Family Search. And there's two tabs here. There's the US censuses and the vital events. And it walks back and it kind of goes for each person in your fan chart. And it says, do you show them as a source for each of the censuses of their life? And if there's a check mark, then I have found them in that source. Now, obviously, and they're focusing on US censuses. So if you had someone that came, one of your ancestors that immigrated in the 1880s from a foreign country, and you don't find them in the United States in the 1880 census, well, that's because they weren't in the United States. You may notice that there's an asterisk by 1890. Most of the 1890 census was burned. And so that makes it challenging because we skip from 1880 to the 1900. But this is helpful to make sure that you've identified at least your direct line ancestors in all the censuses. Okay, so here's some of the useful links that I mentioned. You can see forms at Family Search Wiki. You can see the census forms. Ancestry's got census forms as well. I learned something as I was kind of refreshing, making sure that all of these links still work. At census.gov, while census information is not publicly available until 72 years later, you can, if you have a lot of information about a person and you're willing to pay, I think it was $65, they will do a research, they will look up an ancestor on an unpublished census. There's a form on their website at census.gov. We just showed you TreeSeek. Library of LOC is Library of Congress. Just go look at the state of interest in it and see what kind of maps they have available. There's some fascinating maps at the Library of Congress. And the last link there is to the Newberry Library, newberry.org, and the AHCBP is Atlas of Historic County Boundaries. So we have plenty of time for questions.
Oh, Chris, I think you were probably too thorough.
Too thorough. Well, let me, I will unshare my screen.
Right there at the end, you mentioned TreeSeek.
Yes.
And if people are looking for information on TreeSeek, they can find it in the Family History Guide. It's on project number 1, Family Tree, Goal 12, using charts and forms. And it's the first choice that's listed there, choice A. And it talks about TreeSeek and how to log in and all that information, how to get to TreeSeek and what it is.
It's a great resource if you want to print fan chart. I mean, if you want to print a 10 generation fan chart, they will print with pictures and they do a lot of fun things.
Yeah, it's a great resource. All of you out there, if you would take just a moment and send us a chat and let us know where you're signed in from. Some of you have already. and I appreciate that. But it's always fun to see where people are coming in from. We have one entire ward that signed in, whatnot. And I don't know how many people that is, but an entire ward. That's kind of fun. Okay, we've got Sandy, Holiday, Sandy. It's more of a local audience this time. Great. Well, thank you, Chris. We appreciate it. And like I mentioned before, this video will be available in a couple of days at granitefhc.com, along with a lot of other videos that we've done. And it's a great resource for you as well. So thank you all very much. And we'll see you again next week, many of you, for the next class, which is next Tuesday evening.